Right after the bombs came off, our airplane just blew up into several pieces. It wasn't flying, and it was going to hit the ground and kill us in about 4 seconds. We had to eject. I'm looking up, checking my parachute over enemy territory. Put my hands up, and they captured me. There's no glory without suffering. You can't be a person of character and integrity if you don't have the courage to stand up for it. And courage takes you across the river of fear. My name is Lee Ellis. I retired from the Air Force as a full colonel, been an instructor pilot for many years and commanded a flying squadron. Grew up on a farm. Quick as I could get combat qualified in the F-4 Phantom, I was going to go to the Vietnam War. We're on the flight line, East Flight Line at Randolph Air Force Base, and today we had the Freedom Flight, also called the Champagne Flight, which is what we did in Vietnam when we finished our last mission. It was a way to celebrate finishing the tour in Vietnam safely and going home. But these three guys came home from the POW camp in '73, 50 years ago, and they've never flown an Air Force airplane since. So these three guys, after 50 years, are getting their first military flight in a fighter-type airplane to celebrate coming home. This was the 50th anniversary, and this will be the last one. All the Air Force POWs have flown their Champagne flight as of right now, today.
January 23, 1973. The agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States.
It's been a long time since the Vietnam War ended, 50 years ago now. But what happened was the French had made a colony out of Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh, communist leader of North Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh had become a communist. He wasn't always that way when he was young. Under Ho Chi Minh and some others, they threw the French out. As a result of the 1954 agreement, Vietnam was divided into two parts, the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was run by the communists and Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was more with the U.S. support and more democratic. But Ho Chi Minh and the communists wanted to occupy the South. They started invading and undermining in South Vietnam with guerrilla warfare, and then they started to send troops down there and lots of supplies for the guerrillas and the troops they had there. In the 60s, under President Kennedy, the U.S., trying to help the South stay free from communism, started out with military people there to aid them and help them train and prepare.
Retreat does not bring safety.
President Lyndon Johnson took over, and he kept expanding the war. In late 1964, there was supposedly an attack in the Tonkin Gulf.
North Vietnamese surface vessels attacked U.S. destroyers operating on routine patrol in international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin.
And then in '65, we started sending troops. So by 1968, we had 536,000 troops on the ground in South Vietnam. At my base at Da Nang, I flew missions mostly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's where the roads came down, bringing troops and supplies to the south. When I first got there, we were flying combat missions up in the Hanoi area, which is called Route Package 6. The missions into North Vietnam were to blow up their industries and railroads to keep the supplies down from that part. But we also flew in Route Package 1, which was the southern panhandle of North Vietnam. Our goal was to shut those roads down so they couldn't bring those supplies in. On a combat mission over North Vietnam, two of us, a flight of two F-4s, took off about 3:30 in the afternoon. We flew up to North Vietnam over Route Package 1. We'd blown up the bridge over this river, but they had a ferry that would come in at night bringing troops and supplies to the south. So I was a pilot in the back seat, and I was flying with Captain Ken Fisher. They said, okay, we want you to attack these anti-aircraft artillery sites that are protecting Quang Key Ferry. Right after the bombs came off, our airplane just blew up into several pieces. It wasn't flying, it was going to hit the ground and kill us in about 4 seconds. We had to eject. I pulled that handle and boom, blows me out of the airplane with 18 Gs. Within 1.8 seconds, I'm looking up checking my parachute over enemy territory. With all this shooting going on the ground and tracers going by. So I did my parachute landing fall, and I was a couple hundred meters north of the river within about 90 seconds. Several North Vietnamese militia guys started popping out with their rifles or AK-47s. I had been learned in survival school that your best chance to escape is right after capture because they're the least trained. So I pulled out my .38 revolver, and I thought if I shoot this tracer, I can scare them off. So I fired around to a tracer right over their head, and those guys didn't flinch. One of them pulled out this little card. It has phonetics for Vietnamese. He says, "Surrender, no die, hands up, hands up." Put my hands up, and they captured me. They stripped me down to my underwear, tied my hands, and put a blindfold on me. They put me in the underground bomb shelter, and I heard this guy breathing in there. It was very quiet in there. And I said, "Ken, is that you?" He said, "Yeah, you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, how about you?" He said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And about 2 minutes later, and took me away. It took me about 2 weeks to get to Hanoi. We were bombed and strafed a couple of times. Fortunately, we were out of the way. Arrived at what we called the Hanoi Hilton, a prison built by the French in the 1890s. Occupied an entire block in downtown Hanoi. Walls about 14 feet high with embedded shards of broken wine bottles. Nobody ever escaped there. I don't know if they're going to kill me or what. I have no idea what's going to happen. There were guards behind in this interrogation room. I was the last one there. The other 3 guys, Americans, are sitting there. Camp officer was sitting there behind a table, and this guy was very unusual. He rested his arms, and he looked over and said, "And now the fat is in the fire, huh?" I was so scared, and I was about to break out laughing hilariously at what he had just said. And that's an American idiom, means like you're in trouble. The fat's in the fire, you're about to burn. The guards took us away, and I was put into a 6.5 by 7 foot cell with 3 guys. I went in with Ken Fisher, my fellow pilot from the F-4, and then a Marine F-4 crew. This is my POW uniform that I brought home. I had 2 pairs of black pajamas. You see, they didn't have buttons or zippers, just tie them up. They faded gray. Over 5.5 years I was a POW. I didn't get any new ones, but this particular uniform, normally we didn't wear it in the summertime unless you had to go to an interrogation.
Okay.
And the guard would come in and say, the turnkey would come in and say, That meant put on your long clothes, you know, your long pajamas. So you had to put those on to go to interrogation.
And why was that?
Because you had to be formally dressed.
In uniform?
You couldn't, in uniform. You couldn't be in your shorts and t-shirt to go to an interrogation. This was the formal dress. The Hanoi Hilton was divided into several areas. Where I stayed, that whole section's called Little Vegas. Most fighter pilots had been through Las Vegas because of the Nellis Air Force Base there. So there's 3 or 4 cell blocks, all named after the old casinos in Las Vegas. The Thunderbird, Stardust, the Desert Inn, the Mint. I was in the Thunderbird, and it was mostly 6.5 by 7 foot cells. At the end of that hallway was the Mint, and there were 3 cells there that were 3.5 by 7, and those were solitary confinement cells, where guys would be put for a long period of time in solo, sometimes in leg irons and handcuffs strapped down to their wooden bed. There were guards always in the hall, if you start talking out loud, they're going to come in and drag you out and beat you up or punish you in some way. That was a violation of camp policy because they did not want us to communicate with any of the cells. So it was hard to communicate with anybody there. They had a couple of rooms in the Little Vegas complex where they could take you to torture you. That's where I went for when I was tortured. The first time I was tortured, when I got there, they were really trying to generate anti-war sentiment back home. They were trying to get POWs to make anti-war propaganda for them, fishing to see if they could find somebody who would agree with them. My roommates and I, we said no, name, rank, service number, date of birth. That was all we put down on there. That's the code of conduct. We don't fill out any other answers but that. When we wouldn't do it, they started torturing us with what we called humane torture. They put you on your knees in leg irons with your hands up in handcuffs and your hands are over your head. After a few hours, you can't do that anymore. Your knees, your arms give out, you fall down on the floor, and they'd come in and start beating you up. And you get back up on your knees and you call down and they come in and start beating you up again. This went on and on for about a day. Finally, I decided I just couldn't resist this anymore, that I would give in and fill out the form. Well, I did, but everything was a lie. I felt so bad that I was not able to live up to the code of conduct and never answer any other question other than name, rank, service number, date of birth, that I wasn't tough enough to beat them. I must be the only guy in the world that's ever given in, and I laid there and cried on that filthy floor in handcuffs and leg irons because I had given in and filled out those forms, even though I didn't tell them anything. I just felt like the lowest scum that ever wore a uniform. I get back to my cell and I find out that others had filled it in too. Some of them lasted longer than I did and some of them didn't last as long as I did. Over time, we learned that you would always resist, but if it came to a point where you could mentally or physically going to be really damaged, you'd give in, but not give them anything they wanted. In the Hanoi Hilton, I was there for 8.5 months. One day, we had a window in that cell that was on the inside of the courtyard, and I heard this American say, "Hey, you guys in there hear me?" I jumped up and I looked down. He said, "My name is Judy." He said, "You know the code?" And I said, "No." He said, "It's a 5x5 matrix. A is 1-1, B is 1-2. And about that time, the guard came over and slugged him and dragged him away. Jim Warner, my other cellmate, said, "What's a missing letter?" I said, "I don't know. He didn't tell me." They got dragged away. I said, "It's probably Z." We could hear tap code. We could hear people switching it out, but it didn't always work for some words. Finally, one day, turnkey opened the door, pushed the guy into our cell and slammed the door and left. He'd put the guy in the wrong cell. He thought it was me. We got about 3 hours with this guy from across the hall. We're talking. We said, "Oh, by the way, what's a missing letter in the tap code?" He said, "It's K. Use C for K." We said, "Okay, now we know." If it was a word with just letters in it before K, it worked, but after K, it didn't work. The tap code really helped a lot over the next few years. We were moved out to Sante, which was 25 miles northwest of Hanoi. We moved there in the summer of 1968. We started to communicate. We were tapping through the wall. Always, every day, us against them. We're going to pull something off. We're going to communicate. We're going to steal something. So these are the bracelets, POW-MI bracelets, that came about in the late 60s. Several million people were wearing these around the country. There were more than 1,000 people wearing a bracelet with my name on it and shootdown date, really led by the POW-MIA wives. But it was really representative of the way that the American public put pressure on the communists about our treatment because they had signed the Geneva Conventions, which said that prisoners would be treated humanely and they would be accounted for. The communist government of North Vietnam had not released the names of all who were prisoners and those who were not. But so many people got behind us, the POWs and MIAs, and raised awareness of our situation. In September 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. The new leadership came in, and by that time, they're getting real pressure from back in the United States about our treatment. The new communist leadership in Hanoi decided to stop the torture. We'd been there 2 years. Spring of '70, we started to get to go outside and get suntans, and the food got better. They moved us out of Sante in the summer of 1970 because they had decided to take us to a showplace camp. They had taken an old barracks and divided it into 4 compounds. They put about 50 POWs in each one of those compounds. They're going to bring the media in to show the world we're treating these guys great. U.S. intelligence knew where the camps generally were. Every few months, a drone would come over our camp, 200 feet, right over the camp. In November, U.S. forces, the Green Berets, they raided the Sante camp thinking we're still there. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden we heard these bombs going off, and they raided that camp. They were on the ground for 32 minutes, went through every cell block in that camp, but nobody was there. And they couldn't get us out because we had moved away. They moved us all back to the Hanoi Hilton. And this time they put us in big cells. Now we're in this 1,800 square foot room with no walls in it, and that's where we were for the next couple of years. You think about living with 52 people in an 1,800 square foot cell with no walls in it. It sounds pretty complicated. But now that we're together, it really helps us to pass the time. With 52 guys in a cell, you got an expert about horse racing, photography, or music. We had language classes, French, Spanish, German. One of the guys taught me and another guy differential calculus. He'd write out a problem on the floor and erase it and then write out another one. I was there about 18 months in that cell. In 1972, the North Vietnamese actually invaded the South with full conventional armies. We only had about 25,000 American soldiers left there, and mainly it was just the Vietnamese fighting. The U.S. opened the bombing of North again. They were sending B-52s up there. The Vietnamese were scared, we were cheering. They took 205, which was about half of all POWs at that point, and took us up to the Chinese border and put us in a mountain camp in these prison buildings, but they would hold about 10 or 12 people each. It took us 17 hours in the back of that truck, tied up and blindfolded to get up there. We stayed there for Mother's Day of 1972. In January, when the bombing stopped and they were about to sign the peace agreement, they brought us back to Hanoi, this time loaded in trucks, but no handcuffs, no blindfolds, and they put us in camps based upon our shootdown date. They told us the war was over and we were going to be going home within 60 days. March the 14th, 1973, they gave us our going home clothes. We put them on, put us on a little bus and shuttled us down to the airport where the Air Force would fly the C-141s. They handed us over one at a time and they would check us off. And we get about 30, 40 of us on there, and then they'd close it up, we'd taxi it out and take off. And when we broke ground, you could feel the airplane, those big wheels come off the ground, clunk, clunk. And that's when we started cheering. We got over international waters. Aircraft commander comes over the intercom and says, "Gentlemen, we're now feet wet." That's when the cheering really started. We get back to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, got off the airplane with a crowd cheering for us, which was a total surprise. This is the day we're coming home. It's been 50 years now. This year is the 50th anniversary of our return home. But looking at that video, we got on that airplane and they gave out some cigars and coffee and Cokes and magazines, and I'm not a smoker, but I kind of enjoy a cigar every now and then, and I lit one up that day, and we were celebrating and having such a great time, knowing that we were headed for freedom. We knew we had changed, but we just wanted to get back and get with it and really enjoy life again with our families and friends, and we knew there'd be some challenges, but they weren't going to be like the challenges we had had before. So we were very fortunate to have survived it and returned with honor. That was our goal. I was a POW in Vietnam 5 years, 4 months, and 2 weeks, 1,955 days. You know, I get a lot of questions about, how did you guys do it? How did you do it? You have to be committed to your mission and your purpose. Resist, survive, return with honor. That encompassed our whole mission. We were going to live to the code of conduct. We're going to do our duty. We're going to be good Americans. We're going to be good teammates. And then you have to have courage to stand up for it. They could beat you down. They could force you to give in, but they couldn't force you to give what they wanted. That's going to take some suffering and sacrifice.